Mr. Watson.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jacob. Good evening, everyone. Sound levels okay? Right, everyone get your waters ready. Now, this debate, putting the football aside, is perfectly timed. We're at, putting the football aside, we are at a critical moment in the Brexit process. Last Friday, the Cabinet met at Chequers and agreed the UK's negotiating position to take to the European Union. And tomorrow, we have the Brexit White Paper being published as well. So I want to start there. Jacob, could we start with you, please? You've been quite vocal on the Chequers deal. Do you think it will deliver the Brexit that you want?
No, I don't. But first of all, can I thank everybody for coming? I read on Guido Fawkes that you all work for The Independent, and that was the only way that they could persuade an audience to come along tonight. So I was glad to see The Independent is so fully staffed. No, I don't think it does at all, I'm afraid. That the common rule book is not common. It's the European Union's rule book, which we will be obliged to follow. And if we don't follow it, we will suffer potential penalties. And the European rule book is judged by the European Court of Justice. So it's not the direct effect that we currently have, but it is the same ultimate effect, because currently, if we don't follow a European rule, we can be fined, and the arbiter of it is the ECJ. But we have always had the ability to pass an act of Parliament ignoring any decision made by the European Union. We just never have. So it's a slight tweaking of the words, but the result of this common rule book is that we're in the acquis communautaire for goods and for agri-foods.
Andrea Leadsom, I'd like to bring you in there if possible. So nothing's going to change?
Well, I judge the success of the strategy by the red lines that are set out, I believe, by the Brexit referendum. So I think my understanding of what people voted for was to take back control of our laws, our borders and our money, to get out of the single market and the customs union and the CAP and the CFP, and to, very importantly, to be a globally free trading nation. And I do believe that all those things, I mean, it is the fact that all of those things remain the case under this new proposal. But what's very clever about this proposal is that it actually, as well as not breaching the UK's own red lines, as determined by the referendum result, it also addresses the EU's red lines. And that is the very difficult circle to square. And what it will do is it will force the European Union to take the proposal very seriously. And so until such time as we had a solution that had the potential to meet the EU's red lines, they were simply stonewalling us. So I think now the challenge is for them to come to the table and start taking the UK's offer seriously.
Chukwuemeka, do you think this is going to be taken seriously by the European Union? Has this changed the dynamic at their end?
Well, as you will have seen in my column on Monday, it will be taken seriously by the European Union. And to be honest, I do smile when I hear ministers like Andrea talk as if somehow the obstacle to progress in these negotiations has been the European Union, which is an absurd proposition. What they have asked for is for a position from the UK. And so far, frankly, until Friday, there was no agreement in Cabinet as to what that position should be. I mean, that's the reason they haven't really been able to take anything seriously, because they don't actually know what the position is. So you have Andrea, Liam Fox, until recently, Boris Johnson and David Davis saying one thing, and then you have quite another thing being said by Philip Hammond, Greg Clark, and maybe a couple of other ministers. So you don't really know what the actual position is. And until Friday, there was no coherence. So they're grateful to actually know what it is that they're dealing with. But I think it's, you know, this is an opening gambit. And, I mean, ultimately, I think the problem that the Prime Minister has is it's pleased no one. It's not hard enough for Jacob, who wants a complete break. I think privately, I'm sure that's probably the same view as Andrea. But for me, the idea that this is somehow a soft Brexit, given it doesn't cover most of our economy, which is 80% services, and this is basically a free trade area in goods, it's not going to do the business. What is it? This is not going to do the business for our economy. And the idea, by the way, I mean, this kind of nonsense that we don't have to comply with rules and standards in any event. I mean, there seems to be a consensus in the House of Commons that we all want to access the European markets and sell into it. Well, if you want to do that, they're going to require us to comply with the goods, standards, rules, etc. in any event.
Let me just cut in there, talking about soft Brexit. Dominic, from the other side of the House, you've been pushing the government bit by bit with your very well-worded amendments towards the kind of Brexit that you've been seeking. Do you think the Chequers deal has taken into account the concerns that you had that pushed you to those votes in the House of Commons that we all watched?
It's certainly a major improvement on what I thought were rather unrealistic positions that were being advanced. But I mean, just to make one point clear, if you don't ask, you don't get. So, when the Prime Minister went and did her Florence speech or her Mansion House speech or her Lancaster House speech, she set out a vision which was one which I could quite readily see that if she could achieve it, I would be pleased about. I mean, in the circumstances of leaving, even though I still believe that leaving the EU is a historic mistake, I could see that those would be considerable achievements. But over the course of the year that has passed, I mean, I think there is a much greater degree of clarity about the issues that divide us from the EU in negotiations. And I certainly see the Chequers statement as being realistic. And the truth is that the last year has been largely taken up not with a debate with the EU about our future, because we've never come to them with a concrete proposal for the framework. It's been an internal debate, nationally, concentrated in my party, involving the elements of the Labour Party as well, who I have to say are in many ways as incoherent as we are on this issue, as to what it is that we're really trying to get. If I can just pick one point up. The ECJ and the rule book. Now, perhaps I'm just too much of a lawyer, but I happen to know that we are signed up to something over 13,500 international treaties. We're the greatest treaty-making power in world history, and we've done that because we believe it's in our national interest. And about 800 of those have arbitral mechanisms for resolving disputes on interpretation. I've done some of them when I was Attorney General and lost them, and the government has simply gone on with implementing the decision that was lost. Now, the EU is different in two ways. One, because it's so complex, it has direct effect, as Jacob rightly said, which is an unusual feature for an international treaty obligation, but was done deliberately because they felt that otherwise countries wouldn't put right what was wrong in interpretation. But the Court of Justice of the European Union is just another arbitral tribunal to resolve disputes over interpretation. And if we're going to continue trading with the EU in whatever shape or form we decide to do it, the idea that its jurisprudence and its decision-making is not going to remain as really important and central to our life, whether directly or indirectly, is in truth fanciful. So I don't get worked up about the ECJ. I worry more that we're likely, and Jacob's highlighted this, to end up in a situation where we lack input into the policy making of the EU, but we still have to follow its rules. But even if we decided to do a no-deal Brexit, unless we really want to turn ourselves into North Korea, rules decided upon by the ECJ will still be benchmarks that our businesses and industry will have to follow if we want to trade into the EU market.
So on that note, I'd just like to take a question from the audience. John Newham. Perfect. I believe you have a question on the EEA. Can we, just a moment, John, can we get a microphone to you, please? Thank you.
Does this one work? Now, my question's this. Is a Norway-style arrangement the least worst option? For it respects the decision to leave the European Union whilst retaining the benefits of a single market.
John Mills, you're a businessman. Surely you must think that the Norway-style option is a good option.
Well, I think the Norway-style option does solve some problems for businesses. if you really believe that the problems that businesses face are as serious as they're sometimes made out to be, which I have to say from my experience of international trading, it's much simpler than is often made out. But the Norwegians are not very happy about the arrangement they're in. And I think it's just worth remembering what happened, which was that Norway voted not to join what was then the EEC in 1972 and negotiated a free trade deal with the EU in about 8 months, incidentally, from scratch, which then was supposed to be provisional, but went on. And in the early 1990s, this was then formalized into the European Economic Area, again, as a relatively temporary arrangement. And now, 46 years or whatever it is later, we're still there. But I think the support for the EEA in Norway, as what I remember, is somewhere around about 17–20%, because it is in many ways a very unsatisfactory arrangement. And the reason it's unsatisfactory is because Norway has to comply with the vast majority of what the European Union decides, but has no real say in whether things, in what happens. And this is not a satisfactory situation for Norway, which is a relatively small country. But for the UK to finish up in a situation, the UK is the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world. For us to finish up in a position where large sections of our commercial and economic affairs are controlled by a foreign power, which hasn't by any means necessarily got our interests at heart, seems to me to be a really catastrophic position for us to be in. And although it may be bearable, I suspect it's going to be a very unstable position. It's not going to resolve our relationship with the European Union for the rest of time. It's going to lead to a long period of difficult relations, which I think will upset business as much as everybody else.
Chequers and then Gina Miller. Chequers.
Well, it's funny John says what he says. I actually met with the Norwegian government 2 weeks ago to ask them what their experience has been. And they painted a very different picture to the one that John has just painted. John is right in the sense that they ended up in this position by accident. Many of the original members of the EEA in the end actually joined the European Union, of course, so they were left as kind of a bit of an anomaly, but they believe that they have the best deal you could possibly get outside of membership of the European Union in terms of still being able to have the economic benefits, some of the economic benefits of membership, whilst not actually being in the club. So it's worked very well for them. And although technically John is right that you don't get a vote on EU Council in the way that you do as a full member, of course, by the time these things get to Council, this has always been one of the complaints of those who wish for us to leave the European Union. It's all, they kind of say that by the time things get to the European Council, it's all kind of fait accompli, it's all determined. And what you really need to be is on the committees in the weeds drawing up the rules in the first instance, which is exactly where the EEA countries sit. They sit on the committees that draw up these rules. And if they unanimously decide that they don't wish to apply the rules of the single market in their countries, they can choose not to. Now, in practice, that's very rarely happened because they get to a situation where they are happy with the rules which come out of Council at the end of the process.
Gina, do you think the government is stronger or weaker after the Chequers deal?
Before I answer that, can I just come to this Norway question? Because yes. I also met with the head of Norway. And the answer was, can we have your deal, please? Because actually, we want what you've got. And this idea that you don't have a voice is not quite true, because actually Norway sits on the standing committees, which is where a lot of the decision and the grind and the real work happens before it goes up to Council. So you have to understand the way things work. So there are always, none of this is black and white, and none of this is simple. And actually, Norway does sit on the standing committees. It can have input. It just doesn't go up to the final committee. But at the same time, they are rule takers. And also, which is very disturbing to them, is that they say, and this is what I was told, our border is very simple. There is an agreement on both sides. So the border, we have one border, and there's agreement on both parties, on both sides, about goods going back and forth. You're talking in Northern Ireland of about 300 different border points. So they just don't understand, and they were very envious of what we've got presently. So just to get back to your point about does it weaken the government? I'm sitting here listening, and I do this on a daily basis, probably like many of you in the audience, and I have no idea why some of these conversations are still happening. Angela talks about taking back control of our laws. Only 13.2% of our laws are actually made in the EU. The rest of it we are in control of. We've always had that sovereignty. So why are you repeating these completely meaningless phrases? And then we come to the idea that, you know, it's what the will of the people wanted. How on earth do you actually know what was in the mind of people when they voted? Stop talking about things you have no idea about. Stop blaming people. You should never have given a very complex question to the people of Britain. You should have never put the people of Britain in this position. You should never have done it. But the fact that you've done it, now you need to be honest. So I thought on Friday, finally, we have something to go to Europe with, because Chequers is right on this. We haven't, from all the meetings I do, we've never asked really for anything. We are in a negotiation. You have to go to the table with a plan. So you go to the plan. It would then be negotiated. Get behind the Prime Minister. Everybody, if you've got a better idea, give it to her. You know, help in this process. Help the country with a plan. Give the country the summer off. Go and negotiate. Go and negotiate the deal, Mrs. May. Support her. Everybody support her. Let's see what she can come back with. And then ask the people again to validate it. Just ask them again, is this what you want? Why is that so complicated? Stop scoring political points on all of this. It's really not helpful. This is about people's real lives. This is not about your seats or your powers or the fact you're spending our money. I'm sorry, you're wasting my taxpayer, my money, and everybody's money in this audience. Stop it! Stop it!
Andrew, I'm going to come to you in just a moment, but Jacob, you seem to be gagging to get something out there during that speech.
Well, there's just the fairly obvious point that how come the British electorate were too stupid to know how they were voting the first time?
I didn't say that.
You
Don't
did,
put
basically.
words in my mouth. Excuse me, I did not. Jacob, be honourable.
Gina.
You say you're honourable. Be truthful.
Gina, you had a good 2 minutes.
No, but I didn't say that.
Okay.
You said it was too complicated for them. But the next time it's not too complicated. There is a certain contradiction in that. And it's not too complicated for people. Now, don't talk about lies, because we're all telling the truth on this panel. We just have different views. And I think to start bandying about terms of lies is really discreditable and makes you look foolish, sir. So we will stick with the issue of elections. General elections are complicated, but actually we trust the British voters to make the right decision. They don't necessarily read through every page of every manifesto, but they make their decision, and that is legitimate in itself. The referendum decision was likewise a legitimate decision made by people who had participated in the debate, and we had a turnout that was higher than any general election since 1992. People were interested and were engaged, and so it is reasonable to talk about what people voted for. They voted to leave. They didn't vote to find that they were tied in by second degree, or that they were given a Brexit that meant they were still subject to EU rules. And the problem with Norway is that, yes, it gets EU rules, yes, it has free movement of people, but it doesn't have a completely frictionless border. The only frictionless borders are if you're in, absolutely right, both the customs union and the single market. Just being in one or the other does not remove all friction. But if you're in both, you're still in the European Union. So that, well, the customs union and the single market are the essential building blocks of the European Union. To be out of those and to pretend that to be in those and to pretend you're not in the European Union is just playing with words.
Andrea Leadsom, we are effectively going to be in a single market for goods, are we not, under the Chequers deal?
No, we're not. We're going to be in a free trading area for goods, rather similar to if you're in a free trading area with Japan, with Vietnam, with Australia, with New Zealand, where always, if you're in a free trading area, you do agree to certain common rules, and then you have a dispute resolution mechanism to determine how you respond in the event that one side decides not to go along with the other side. That's what we're talking about here. There will be, in every case, when there's a new rule introduced, UK Parliament will vote on it. And if UK Parliament votes not to implement a rule, then there will be a dispute resolution mechanism where both the UK courts and the EU courts will judge over what would be a proportionate response to that decision not to go along with those rules. So I think that's a really important point, which a lot of people haven't understood. But just to Gina's point about a second vote, I mean, I absolutely agree with Jacob. You know, we trust people in general elections. And just because you don't like the answer, I mean, I was actually wondering with my team earlier today whether we should perhaps go for a penalty shootout. Perhaps we should just go for lots and lots and then go for the sort of best of 6 or something. I mean, where would you draw the line? We had a very serious debate at huge expense where all sides of the argument put their views very, very clearly and forcibly, and then the people decided. And we respect the decision of the people. And for anyone to say, oh, it's too complicated or, you know, anything else is simply not valid. The decision was taken. Parliament overwhelmingly voted. 4 out of 5 parliamentarians voted to allow people to have their say. That was a democratic decision by democratically elected politicians to give people their say. They had their say. It's simply anti-democratic to suggest that they got it wrong and therefore they should have another say.
Sorry, Andy, you're talking to me about democracy. That's a joke. I'm sorry, but you didn't stand up and say that the government couldn't have done. I shouldn't have had to have been put on a stage to do something that the MPs should have done. You actually should have not allowed the government to say that they was going to use the royal prerogative, but that's in the past.
Tina, I'm just going to cut you off there because we're going to have a whole section on courts and second referendums at the end. So let me just, we're going to come to the audience in a moment as well. Just one more question on the Chequers deal. Do you foresee having to extend the transition period to get the new customs arrangements in place?
No, we've been, you know, the Prime Minister has been very clear. An implementation period, I mean, actually going back to what Chuka was saying about how we've not put anything out there at all, and that's simply not true. You know that, Chuka. You know that there was a timetable agreed that, first of all, it had to be discussions about the Northern Ireland border, about the rights of EU citizens, about the divorce bill, about the implementation period. That was the sequencing. Now we're on to the future trading arrangement. So in the past, that was not on the table. So to say that the government's come up with nothing isn't true. It wasn't on the table for discussion at that point. So now we are talking about the future trading arrangement. And yes, we are looking at an implementation period. Nothing's agreed till everything's agreed. We're not going to be changing or lengthening or delaying or having another vote or anything of that sort. What we're doing is we're trying to deal with our own red lines, not to breach those in any sense at all, because of the democratic will of the people. We're also trying to address the EU's red lines in order to bring them to the table. But the alternative, as very clearly set out at Chequers, is we're also ramping up our no-deal preparations to make sure that if the EU will not engage properly, then we will be leaving with no deal. That's part of the negotiation, and it's part of the work that I'm proud to be working on in government as part of that negotiating strategy, not with any hope or expectation of having to turn to no deal, but with a realistic proposition on the table that the EU must now take seriously.
Quickly, Chuka.
Well, first of all, if you listen to what the head of HMRC has said about implementing a new customs regime, I think it's highly doubtful that that is going to be done by the end of the transition period. I mean, you just need to look at the evidence that has been given to various parliamentary select committees. Secondly, if you look at the timetabling of the process, yes, the bill was resolved at the December Council, and there was, to the greatest extent, agreement around citizens' right. But clearly, the big issue, the Northern Irish, the border on the island of Ireland, has not been resolved. And we were supposed to, hang on just a minute, and under the timetable that your government agreed, you were supposed to move on to discussions around the future trading relationship in March. That did not happen because your cabinet could not agree until Friday what it wanted to do. And actually, at the June Council, there was an expectation, when you looked at when the timetable was set originally, that there would be at least outline terms of agreement around the future trading relationship. And that discussion hasn't properly got going because the government hasn't been able to come up with a single proposition. That is a fact.
Okay, I'd like to open it up to the floor for a couple of questions. Gentleman in the white shirt in the third row. If we can just have a microphone. Thanks, Imogen.
Go back to the referendum. The Brexit supporters promised the same benefits out of Europe, or better, than we have now. Yet, we are now seeing that that is not the case. You know, that's the point. You know, sort of, they promised so much. So if they promised they can't meet their promises, so why shouldn't we have a second referendum? Even Nigel Farage said if it was 48-52%, and he said this before the referendum, he said if it was 48-52% in favour of Remain, they should have, the Brexiters should have a second referendum. So why not the Remainers?
Jacob Rees-Mogg, Nigel Farage has said it might be time for a second referendum. Is there any circumstances, any situation in which you think it might be right to go back to the people?
My view is that you have to implement the vote that has taken place, that we've had a referendum and the result is to leave. I think the idea that you should have a referendum until you get the result you want is, as Andrew rightly said, anti-democratic. Do I think that at some time in the future the British people would be entitled to have a referendum to rejoin the European Union? Yes, of course they do. We may decide in 30 years' time that that is in the national interest. But first of all, there has to be the implementation of the referendum we had in 2016, validated by the general election, when both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party said they would respect the result of the 2016 vote. And the party that said it didn't want to respect the vote, the Liberal Democrats, did exceptionally badly. And I think that's very important. There were actually 3 votes around the referendum. There was the general election which David Cameron won promising a referendum. There was the referendum itself. And then there was last year's general election when the 2 major parties both said they would accept the result. And I think that's important, and I think democracy ought to be respected.
I'm going to take one more question in this section. I will be coming back for more. Is there anyone who has a question about the Chequers deal, about customs union, about single market? Gentleman over there in the black T-shirt.
Sorry, I've just been working for a company and we've been exporting food to Europe. We have to comply with European regulations on food, otherwise we wouldn't be able to sell the product into that market. So to me, it's if we leave Europe, we will have no say in those regulations, and I'm not sure how we will sell our products on. Therefore, how will we get tax revenue to be able to fund the NHS, to social care, and all the things that our country needs? This is, and most of the trade deals done around the world are not done with individual countries, they're done with groups of countries. So if we came out of the EU, we would have to develop trade deals with groups of countries and have to follow their regulations and their requirements. The other thing about the legal aspect of it is the contracts have been raised with these customers, and they are settled in the UK courts. But the UK courts take into account the rulings of European Union. And
Can I push you for a question, sir?
Okay, well, the question is, how do you feel the future tax revenues are going to be maintained in the future if we lose 500 million, 600 million customers in Europe?
Dominic Grieve.
Our tax revenues, in my view, are not going to be maintained. And that's one of the reasons why, firstly, I campaign to remain. And it's also one of the reasons when faced with the choices that we have to make in view of the referendum result, although I do find some aspects of them unsatisfactory, I consider that maintaining the closest possible economic and trading relationship with our EU partners seems to me to be in the national interest, despite the drawbacks that Jacob highlights, because I happen to think that Jacob's model is going to deliver falling revenues and an inability to fund our public services. It's a very simple issue. Just coming back just briefly to the earlier matter, which was about the validity of referendums, I accept the referendum result. I do so with a heavy heart, but I voted to trigger Article 50. But you really cannot turn what the referendum question was into things it was not. And unfortunately, as always happens in this sort of debate, The question that was asked has a very abstract quality about it. It says only one thing: we want to leave the European Union. The form of the relationship that might be followed thereafter is completely up in the air. And on top of that, time passes. And I certainly don't think it would be improper to ask people again at the end of this process, if there is evidence of change in public mood, whether this is still something they want to do or not. I'm not saying that that is what ought to happen, but certainly from my point of view, it's not something, and I said this very early on after the referendum, it hasn't come new to me, I said I was unwilling to exclude any such possibility. All that is part of a legitimate democratic process. We could, the other possibility is to have a general election on the issue, saying that if we were to complete the deal, the people must put into Downing Street a government that is prepared to do it, because there may be some parties or bits of parties or new parties, for all I know, which say they're not willing to do it, and other parties which are very enthusiastic about it. This is the grist of democracy, and what we can't have is the shutting down of debate. But some of these issues do have a hypothetical quality. I agree with Gina, actually. The moment, the current issue is, what sort of deal can the government get? And as we have now started that process, I am certainly willing to let the Prime Minister get on with the business of seeing what can be achieved. But we do have to recognise that in the background of that, the debate at home amongst parties, amongst individuals within parties, is going to continue. This is just about the most important decision we have made outside of wartime in our modern history, and its consequences for us, if we get it wrong, will be dire.
On that note, I'm going to take a question from Twitter. James asks on Twitter, and I'd like to put this to you, please, John, what kind of deal would produce a better relationship with Europe than remaining a member of the EU?
Well, I think that there is a concept that could have been implemented if it had been started at the beginning, which is that we go for something like the Canadian deal that was negotiated by the European Union, which would, I think, have been relatively easy to change into being, well, it would have been a free trade deal, which would have left us in a slightly different position for trading with Europe, taking up the point that was made just now, because the paperwork is a little bit more complicated if you don't have what's called free movement. Instead, you have a free trade area where you've got slightly more complicated paperwork involving things like certificates of origin. But that if it had been tariff-free, it would have been really very similar to what we've got at the moment. And if we managed to achieve that, which would sort out the trading arrangements that we've got with Europe to a very large extent, and we'd managed to continue with all the cooperation with Europe, where it obviously makes sense on terrorism and climate change and all these other things, I think we then would have had the benefits of being close to our continental neighbours without the incubus that we've got with heavy net payments on the budget, and difficulties over laws and immigration and the common agricultural policy and the common fishery policy and all these other things, which I think were motivated for people for voting against. So I think there is a model that was there. It didn't happen because of the way the negotiations went. I think we got bogged down on Northern Ireland and on citizenship and on money before we started talking about trade, and then we had the general election, and then we had all the shenanigans in Parliament and the House of Lords, and this has all drifted away, and now we've finished up with, I think, a pretty unsatisfactory compromise. And my fear about this compromise is it just won't last. In the end, it'll fall apart. The whole European issue, the whole of Euroscepticism will continue, and I think we will have lost an opportunity to have got ourselves established with a better sort of relationship on an intergovernmental basis with our European neighbours. I think the opportunity has been lost, and I think that's a shame.
I'm just going to change tack a little bit, and you mentioned immigration there. It was obviously an issue that lots of people voted on. Can I take a question from Keith Woolger, please? Keith?
It seems to me that the referendum process and outcome has A, contributed to xenophobia in this country, as we have effectively said foreigners are no longer welcome, and B, helped encourage a rise in the popularity of less democratic movements in the rest of Europe, as well as in the UK, as we seek to withdraw our moderating influence from Europe. Please comment.
Gina Miller, how has the debate or our attitude to immigration changed because of Brexit?
So I went around the country on the referendum trail before. I was very actively, and I deliberately went to areas where I knew they were very supportive of leave. And immigration was definitely on the agenda as being something that people were worried about. And I think we have to go back to Cameron to discover why is it that we did have control. We could have had more control than we had before. We did have rules that we could have implemented. But as far as I understand, because I'm not a politician, is that an assessment was made that it was more expensive to actually bring in those rules to track people for 3 months, or whatever the rules were, than to actually just have open borders. So that's one of the things I realised. But the other thing is, it's not directly that question, I would say. What I can only talk about my experience and what I see around the country is that it's allowed people who have always been there, who have been quite extreme, they've been allowed to be centre stage. And it's created a place where their voices are quite loud now. So I don't think that we're less moderate. I still think we're one of the most tolerant nations in the world. I fear the second part of your question is that not just on immigration, but also from drafting legislation, from directives, from negotiating trade deals, actually the talent that the UK has supplied in the EU is significant. And we have been leaders in that, and we have contributed to not just trade, because, you know, all of this gets bogged down into money. There are things bigger than money, which is peace and coming together as communities. And we have been leading that. And from all the conversations I've had with the EU, is they're not just sad that we're leaving, and they're over the anger of us leaving. But the conversations I have is that they are in mourning for the loss of our talent. And that's significant to me, because we should be leading change. We should be leading in a world that's becoming more and more unstable, that's going towards populism and protectionism. Britain is significant leaders in so many areas, and that is my pity, is that we are leaving the stage that we should be leading.
Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob, the business community doesn't seem completely convinced by Brexit yet, particularly on the immigration front, on the talent front. Do you think they're right to be concerned?
It depends what you mean by the business community. If you mean the EU-funded CBI, they've got everything wrong in the whole of their history. So I wouldn't take any notice of them. But on the immigration front, I think one of
what about BMW and Nissan?
Oh, BMW doesn't want 10% tariffs applied to BMW cars coming into the United Kingdom. The UK is the biggest market for German cars. It's 50% bigger than the American market. And the German companies had a profits warning when tariffs were threatened on the Chinese market, which is their third largest market behind both Britain and the UK. It's a huge vested interest from the German car manufacturers in keeping us within the European Union, and that inevitably colours their view and their decision-making. And the other car manufacturers also benefit from this 10.2% tariff within the EU, which we can get rid of once we've left and have free markets and therefore have lower cost cars for British consumers. And I'm on the side of consumers rather than of vested interests. But I want to come back to immigration because I think the issue was taking control. And what's so interesting is that you saw last month that almost everybody in this country wanted the number of visas for doctors and highly skilled people coming into this country increased. People aren't anti-immigration per se, they are anti-uncontrolled immigration. And the EU gave us uncontrolled immigration. What we want is to have the high-skilled people coming that we need and are economically beneficial, but we don't want to have so many low-skilled people, partly because they do reduce the wages of the lowest skilled in this country, and it's a good thing if they have higher wages, but they also discourage innovation and automation, one of the reasons why our productivity has lagged behind. And if you look at Europe more broadly, you see what a problem uncontrolled migration has done to the European Union. Look what Hungary has done in terms of putting up a wall. Look at the mood in Italy because of uncontrolled migration. Look at the political issues in Germany. It is all about taking control and ensuring that it is sensibly done and managed. And then people are able to be open and generous, which is, I think, where the British people are in their heart of hearts.
Dominic Grieve.
I think we've got to be just a little careful about conflating two things. There's no doubt that people were very stirred in the run-up to the referendum by the sight of the European Union losing, as they would see it, control of its external borders, so that large numbers of people flocked in to the European Union. And that alarmed people. It was quite clear on the doorstep. And of course, interestingly, the United Kingdom is at least in part protected from that because we're not part of Schengen, and the people who came in couldn't, at the moment or until they got citizenship of EU countries, come to this country except in some very, very restricted forms. As for the internal migration coming here from within the European Union, it's never made up more than 50% of our total immigration, and it has been overwhelmingly the result of people coming here to work. Now, I accept that we don't have control over that, although who knows, the EU may be evolving its own thinking on this subject, ironically, with us as a third country outside of it, and providing greater barriers, and we're not going to be able to provide input to it. But I'm not really sure that at the end of the day, if the reality of our economic needs is that, in fact, a similar number, if we're in an economic boom period, are going to be coming in from the EU, and the government's already creeping in that direction with some of the announcements it's been making about the visa regimes it intends to introduce. I find that to make this a fundamental issue for pulling out of the EU, when, of course, it is one of the underpinnings of how a single market works, very odd. And I do think that during the course of the referendum, there was a great deal of debate which missed the point about the true nature of migration from the European Union. And I think it's a very bad basis on which to decide to leave an organisation which delivers lots of other benefits. As for the xenophobia, I don't think we're responsible for the xenophobia in Europe at all. I mean, populism and the rise of xenophobic movements due to failures collectively by the EU long predate our referendum. But I happen to agree with Gina that in this country it has unleashed comment from people who previously were suppressed or were not able to express views. I get quite plenty of them come through my emails, including the death threats. And it's perfectly apparent the sort of people who now feel free to express themselves in the way that previously, for some reason, they felt unable to.
Andrew Ledson, there has been quite a dark vein of aggression that's been perhaps not released, but uncovered since the referendum, is there not? Do you disagree with that?
First of all, I completely agree with Dominic that the UK is in no way responsible for the rise in xenophobia in Europe. I think that would be a very harsh judgment from the gentleman if he was to lay that at our door, and it's certainly not something that people in the United Kingdom would welcome. But I also entirely agree with Jacob that actually my understanding very clearly on the doorsteps and on the campaign trail was that what people wanted was control over immigration. Not necessarily numbers, but control. They wanted to feel that there was control by UK Parliament. And actually, what I really did want to just say is, I hear everybody saying, we need to have free movement with the European Union. But actually, we've just had the most superb Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. We've had some excellent meetings recently with Canada, with Australia, with New Zealand, all of whom are incredibly keen to have more movement towards the UK and to their countries. And under a new immigration set of rules that we will be introducing as we leave the European Union, we will actually be able to spread that fairness. So at the moment, we are very much limited as to our ability to invite people to this country from other countries, such as from our Commonwealth colleagues and friends of great long standing, precisely because the numbers net coming to the UK have been so huge. And Jacob is absolutely right. There is a wealth of evidence that says that at the bottom end, the competition for jobs has held wages down and has discouraged investment. So actually, by having a proper immigration policy where we're in control of it, we will be able to be much more generous, much more outward-looking. The opportunities for young people, for trade, for moving around the world instead of just with the European Union will be significantly better.
Raised eyebrows from Chukwuemeka.
Well, it's just ludicrous, isn't it? I mean... you're talking as if your government doesn't have this target of reducing net immigration to the tens of thousands. If you lifted this ridiculous arbitrary target, then maybe you could argue that changing our arrangements with Europe will allow for many more people to come from Australia and the Commonwealth countries, etc. But so long as you have this ridiculous net immigration target, that is certainly not going to happen. I mean, where I do agree with what people have said, I wouldn't necessarily argue that our country has become more xenophobic or racist, but what this has done, this debate, it has given permission to those who held those views, who didn't feel able to express them in ways they haven't before. And I have to say, I mean, you know, I grew up in my constituency. When I was growing up, my family quite unusual, a mixed-race family. I'm a quarter Irish, quarter English, and half Nigerian. And I don't think I can ever remember a time, although the NF were active in Streatham in the 80s, where I'd ever seen major NF graffiti or that style graffiti anywhere until this referendum happened. And that is the first time I saw that kind of nasty, dark underbelly to the immigration debate actually appear in my own constituency. And actually, the irony is, and my constituency scored the highest Remain vote in the country. I'm very proud of that. But the irony is that we probably have more immigrants than I imagine any other constituency MP on this panel. 40% black minority ethnic, a large Polish community, both recent and historic. And actually I made a point after the referendum, because we scored the highest Remain vote, of going to the areas that scored the highest Leave vote, particularly Boston. I spent a whole amount of time there. Now, I didn't find a bunch of old racists, which is the kind of stereotype. I didn't find that. I found a set of concerns around immigration which actually weren't terribly related to the European Union, but were often related to domestic decisions that governments of different persuasions have not made over the decades. So they were worried about the lack of school places, which might have something to do with the reduction in school funding. They worried about the strain on the health service and really acknowledged you're much more likely to be treated by somebody from Eastern Europe than to be sitting next to them in the queue to see the doctor. All of that. I think the big thing that we have got wrong in this country when it comes to immigration is we are so utterly fixated on numbers, we don't do nearly enough to think about what happens to people who come and settle into our country and how we properly integrate them. Because the biggest complaint of all, that particularly the older citizens I met in Boston had, was that they are living next to neighbours from other European countries who they often can't have a conversation with because they're waiting for the neighbour's child to come back from school and translate for them. And it wasn't that they didn't want the neighbour in their community, but they wanted to get to know them and understand them as people. And I think herein lies often what the issue is. This economic stuff, I mean, you can argue the statistics on this. Nationally, there is generally no evidence to show that EU citizens have generally, across the board nationally, depressed wages. I mean, for God's sake, we've got 750,000 job vacancies in our economy, so all the jobs are not being taken by these Eastern Europeans. But people do feel that with globalisation and change, there is a challenge in some areas to what it is to be English, and my English town. Now, if you get integration right, then you can deal with that very easily. My late father is a great example of that. He went so far when it came to integration that he married an English-Irish woman and had mixed-race children. But he didn't want to come here to spread his Nigerianness, right? He was going to hold on to that, and of course we had Nigerian food in the house, but he absolutely wanted to embrace what it was to be English as well. One of his first jobs was working at the South African Mining Corporation's kitchens, where the chef there, he washed the plates, the chef taught him how to make shepherd's pie, apple pie, all that stuff. That is where we need to be. Where we don't need to be is the disgusting posters which were put out by Vote Leave suggesting that if we carried on in the European Union, millions of Turkish people were going to come to our country and that they were going to commit all these crimes, not to mention the disgusting posters that Leave.eu put out, because what they were doing there was deliberately whipping up anti-immigrant sentiment, whether it was to EU citizens, immigrant, or people of my background. Brits living here, second, third generation from immigrant families, never ever having had to face the kind of hatred that they found during that referendum because of what was whipped up, and totally irresponsible.
I'm going to interrupt you there, Chuck, and just change tack a little bit again.
Sorry, I just get so angry about it.
I'm just going to change tack a little bit, and obviously one of the key features of the Brexit debate so far, the Brexit process, has been the arguments that are going on within both of the main parties. And on your side of the House, there's obviously a Labour Party that's divided along various lines. I'm just going to ask you a hypothetical question. If Jeremy Corbyn was to be removed as leader of the Labour Party, do you think you would put yourself forward?
Highly unlikely, to be honest.
There's going to be a time, isn't there? There's going to be a time, possibly.
Well, look, he's probably not going to be there in 100 years, but I think that is highly unlikely to be happening anytime soon, and certainly not before the scheduled date of departure from the European Union.
Would you fancy a crack at it?
Not at the moment, no.
You've got a good spiel on the immigration and everything else. You know,
I think that's a question whether I'd fancy a crack at it. I'm not sure the Labour Party would have me, to be quite frank. But this is, when it comes to the Labour Party, I mean, Dominic alluded to it earlier. You know, both the main parties are divided on this issue. And in many respects, it would be weird if we weren't, because we're supposed to reflect the country, and the country is divided on this issue. But look, I'm very clear. I think my party needs to have a clear, distinctive position. You cannot maintain fudge. And fudge I don't like saying fudge, because I actually quite like fudge. But let's call it constructive ambiguity. You've got to make a decision about what you want here, in the same way that the government is being forced to do so. And you can't practice. This is the problem that the government has had. This is why it's taken so long for Cabinet to come up with a position, is because they practice cakeism, trying to have your cake and eat it, which the gentleman there was talking about. You just can't do that. I mean, who the hell would join the European Union if you could have all the benefits, all the nice sweeties and cakes, but you didn't have any of the obligations? Who the hell would join the thing?
Gina, as the only person here who's sort of not affiliated to a political party, do you find that there is one political party who is practicing less cakeism than the other, or are they both as bad as each other?
Isn't the irony that we got here because of a split Conservative Party? And we're now in the situation of a split in the two main parties, and the opposition party is not doing its job, which is holding the government to account. And while all of this is going on, what is happening to our country? What is happening to our domestic policies? What's happening to the domestic causes of Brexit? There isn't any bandwidth. I mean, this is why I don't understand why we don't come to a place where we just, as I said earlier, support the Prime Minister, get her deal, come back, so we can draw a line under this, because this whole idea we're going to go round and round and round. No, we're not. We're going to have to get to a point where we have an amnesty on this, where we say, whatever the government comes back with, that's it. As I say, I would go back to the fact, I don't know why anybody is so against the idea and thinks this whole idea that democracy died 2 years ago, but the idea that it's one vote, one time, and that's it. But, check in with the real will of the people right now, 2 years later, and then move on, because we're going to have to, whatever comes out of that, we have to move forward, because the world is moving forward. What's happening in America is very worrying. What's happening in China is very worrying. And here we are just navel-gazing. So could we please get to a point where we actually get to a decision that we can move on with, and we can start running this country? Because both of the parties are not being responsible here. And I keep going back to, again, it's our tax, it's our money that you're spending, squabbling and playing these games.
Andrea Ledson.
Just to be very clear, where we are right now, employment has never been higher. Unemployment hasn't been lower since the 1970s. 90% of children are attending good and outstanding schools. In 2010, it was about 65%. We've got more... Well, I'm sorry, but I'm giving you facts. So please just... Please,
hang on.
Listen. Please do listen.
Sorry. No heckling from the floor, please. I'll call you.
I'm trying to tell you what is happening in the country. So more people are living through cancer treatment, through all sorts of long-term illnesses than ever before. The NHS is seeing millions more people, carrying out hundreds of thousands more operations than ever before. Young people are employed in great droves. We're now going to have 3 million new apprenticeships, something that in 2010 there were a few tens of thousands. So real opportunities for training and skills for young people. We have more disadvantaged young people going to university than ever before. And during this Parliament, just during this Parliament, we've already passed the spaceflight bill, the automated vehicles bill. We've passed bills looking at counter-terrorism, at tenants' fees to make it easier for people to get homes that are safe and secure.
Andrea,
so there is a huge amount that's going on under this government. And so it's simply not the case that we're coasting or navel-gazing.
Well, you've got, 5 million children living in poverty, record numbers of people...
Hang on a minute. I'm just going to bring us back to Brexit for a moment. Andrea, I have a question from someone who backs Brexit from Twitter. Is the government actually behind a hard Brexit to firm up our borders? Do you believe that?
So I don't accept that there's such a thing as a hard Brexit or a soft Brexit. Okay, we're leaving the European Union, and what that means is, you don't need me to repeat it, but it means we'll be leaving the jurisdiction of the ECJ, we'll be leaving, we'll be putting free movement behind us, we'll be stopping paying EU subs, we'll be out of the single market and the customs union, CAP and CFP. That's what means leaving the European Union. And what we're seeking to do in government, is to create a scenario that respects the red lines set out by the result of the referendum, but at the same time enables us to meet the EU's red lines, enables us to continue to trade freely and openly with the European Union to a much more limited extent, absolutely true, and very importantly enables us to keep the UK internal market absolutely intact. That's what this agreement will seek to do.
Was there ever a moment last weekend when Boris and David were writing their resignation letters? Because reports have that you spoke up against the Chequers deal at Chequers. Obviously, you're the only person that can confirm that. Did it ever cross your mind when you were thinking, is this something I can support, whether you should resign as well?
So, as I said, I've been clear. I've already said this. To me, I judge it against the yardstick of the democratic referendum in this country. If we were breaching those red lines that I think were set out by the referendum result, then that would be a problem. But I do not think we're doing that. What I do think is that this is a very clever arrangement that enables us to bring the EU seriously to the table to look at a very workable and logical plan that enables friction-free trading in goods to continue. And in the subject of services, as I'm sure everybody here will appreciate, there is much less of an issue around friction at the border for services. And when you're particularly looking at financial services, we are absolutely preeminent in the world. There isn't another financial services centre of the size and quality of the United Kingdom's financial services sector. And so it's simply not the case that the UK needs to become somehow a rule taker with the European Union. What we need to do is to work together.
Could you see yourself backing the deal if further compromises are made? Or does this have to be the deal that's agreed?
Do you want me to say it again? I will be looking at whether our red lines have been breached. And what's very important is that what we've proposed is something that is workable, in line with our red lines, and at the same time, we are stepping up our preparations for no deal in order to make clear to the European Union that if they refuse to engage with this, that does address their red lines, then we will be prepared to consider leaving without a deal.
So you didn't express unhappiness with what was being proposed at
I won't
Chequers?
comment on what happened at Chequers. That was a cabinet meeting. You know that, Chuka.
Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Well, usually, actually, with the relaxation of collective responsibility, is usually put out there very quickly.
Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jess on Twitter asks if Theresa May can actually deliver the Brexit that people voted for. Do you think she can?
Oh, yes, she can, but it's not Chequers.
I'd like to open that up to the floor. Gentleman with the glasses over there. If we can just wait for the microphone, please. Thank you.
For the leavers here, Jacob, maybe, what is the ideal Brexit for you?
The ideal Brexit is where we maintain free trade with the European Union and we extend free trade to the rest of the world. That the opportunity will be to, once we're out of the customs union and the common external tariff, to remove tariff and non-tariff barriers, to allow people in this country, consumers in this country, to buy the goods that they want at a lower cost, which will give them a greater disposable income and will also make our industry more efficient because, first of all, it will have to compete, but also its input costs will be reduced. That is the advantage of moving to free trade across the world and is a great benefit. I want to see, once we've left the European Union, a friendly relationship with Europe, but one where we are not a rule taker, because only, 12-13% of our business is with the European Union, but it regulates 100% of our business. And those regulations are not necessarily ones that we would need. That's why it's so important that we are outside of this rule book, and that we want to be in a position where the taxes we pay aren't going to subsidise continental Europe. We've already got a very large overseas aid budget. Why should we double it up by overseas aid to European nations as well? So it's saving our money, it's opening up to free trade, it's taking control of our borders, but doing so in a way that says to the European Union that we're leaving the European Union, we're not leaving Europe. We should remain very friendly. And I thought on day one we should have said to the European Union nationals living here that they would be entitled to stay and that we were not the sort of country that was interested in deporting millions of people. It was a great mistake that we ever started negotiating about individuals living here. So I want us to try to be generous about things, but to be clear that leaving is a clean break and allows us the economic opportunities of determining our own future.
John Mills, what's your perfect Brexit? I think you said earlier on Canada plus plus plus. Is that about right?
Well, I don't think it's that different from what Jacob's just said. And I do think it's worth remembering that although we've got a very high preponderance of Remain Labour MPs, and indeed in membership of the Labour Party is very Remain-orientated as well, nearly 40% of the people who voted Labour in 2015 voted Leave in the referendum in 2016. And I think the Labour Party is in real danger, if it's not very careful, of losing a wide measure of support, which it really needs if it's going to win the next election, particularly among the C2s, Ds and Es, where some polls that have been produced recently by YouGov showing something like a 10% swing away from the people supporting Labour to supporting the Conservatives. And that's enough to make quite a lot of seats in Wales and Midlands and the North vulnerable in a general election. So I think Labour's got to be very careful in positioning itself over all this to make sure that it doesn't become so dominated by the Remain camp that it loses the support of a vital section of the people. Labour Party is a very awkward coalition in many ways between a sort of intellectual, idealistic, middle-class group and traditional working-class people. But if the Labour Party is going to be successful in the next general election, it needs to bring both camps with it, not just one.
Chukwuemeka, can Labour appeal to those working-class voters in Wales, north of England?
Yes, because you...
Can they do it in the EEA, is your strategy?
Yes, absolutely. Look, the reason that, and let's not run away from it, the reason why a lot of traditional Labour voters in the North East, in the West Midlands, in Yorkshire, voted to leave the European Union was down to concerns around immigration. And when you dug under that, I've already mentioned the cultural aspect, but you know, what do people really care about? Why the concern? Because of concerns about your job, whether you'll get a job, how much you're paid, schools investment, health investment, all the rest of that. So the causes of Brexit in that sense are not going to be solved by Brexit. And I think the worst thing would be for the Labour Party to lie to our voters and say that we believe you can solve those issues by leaving the European Union and not making the domestic reforms and adopting a different model of capitalism which will ensure that we get prosperity for the most people. But the Labour Party, to my mind, cannot have it both ways. It can't, on the one hand, pretend it agrees that immigration has been the cause of problems in, fundamental problems, deindustrialization in many of these communities where there are very few immigrants, and at the same time expect, immigrant communities, black and minority ethnic communities, to support them whilst giving a nod and a wink, suggesting that immigration is the cause of our problems in this country. We had exactly the same challenges as a Labour Party when we were dealing with the end of free movement from the Commonwealth in the 1970s. I went and read some of the debates we had then. Our Shadow Home Secretary at the time was Jim Callaghan. And, the same arguments were being made in respect of the Windrush generation and then South Asian people, West Africans. All the same arguments were being made about their presence and their numbers coming here and the impact of the economy, which was all a fiction. You hear the same arguments now being made about Eastern Europeans. And I do not want a Labour Party that will just go along with that, because it's wrong.
Jacob, you've put down several amendments to the government's trade bill, which is coming back to the House of Commons on Monday. How many backbench Tories do you expect to vote for those amendments?
Well, a number of them support government policy, so the government may adopt them and introduce them into the bill. One of them is to put into law that there will not be a border down the Irish Sea, and just to make that a legal obligation rather than a promise of the government. And I think, as I'm putting down something supportive of government policy, you may find that it's adopted. Who knows? As for whether there will be any rebellions, we'll have to wait and see on Monday as to what motions are pushed to a division, what motions are adopted by the government, and, of course, what the Labour Party decides to do.
Do you think the government should adopt all of those motions?
Well, of course I do. I wouldn't have put them down otherwise.
Andrew Ledson? Do you think the government could accept any of Jacob's amendments?
Well, the government will be considering. I mean, I've just seen them just before coming out this evening, so the government always looks very carefully at amendments. I mean, actually, what's I think quite interesting is with the EU withdrawal bill, we had 290 hours of debate in both houses, 1,480 amendments. I mean, that is a record, and 1,200 of them were not government amendments. So there's been a huge amount of debate and working together with groups, and that bill changed quite significantly from the start to the finish. So I think the interesting thing about this Parliament that often goes unremarked is quite how much collegiate working there is on bills and trying to bring in. I mean, Dominic was absolutely, probably wrote 1,100 of those 1,200 non-government amendments. And but I think, Dominic, you and I might agree on this, that there's been a lot of debate on improving legislation.
That's what we're actually sent to Parliament to do. So exactly. Tabling amendments are there so that they can be a subject of debate. It's not necessarily a sign that people are going to vote for them or not listen to what the government's saying. And indeed, the bill was substantially improved as a result of it. There were even some amendments that Jacob and I agreed on some of the Henry VIII clauses. So that's the perfectly normal business of Parliament. Equally, it does sometimes happen that amendments get put to the vote, and so and parties divide on that issue. But that's also part of the process of democracy.
Coming back to you, Jacob, and your amendments, just one last question on them. Is there any one in particular, the reciprocity one that I'm thinking of, is that something that feasibly could actually be adopted by the EU? It feels like something that's being put there as something that could never possibly be taken on as a negotiating position.
Well, it seems only fair that if we should be a tax collector for the European Union, it should be a tax collector for us in return, and that if we're collecting its tariffs, then the EU should collect our tariffs where they differ. And the Prime Minister said in her Lancaster House speech that this should be an agreement between equals. It shouldn't be one between essentially a serf and a lord. So I think we should have reciprocity and equality between us in how taxes are collected. I think it would be very odd for the government to want to do anything else. So I would expect the government to accept this amendment with alacrity and enthusiasm, with the Prime Minister herself to put her name to it.
Gina Miller, how do you read the amendments that are going down in the situation at the moment.
Well, it's a bit unfair, because they haven't yet been published. They had to be down by the close of business today. They will be published on the order paper tomorrow. So I think anybody who...
They're on Twitter right now.
Yeah, they're on Twitter.
Well, the House of Commons works at its historic pace.
Well, didn't you take pictures of them? I was presuming you must have taken pictures of them.
But I didn't put them on Twitter.
Anybody can go up to the office and
take pictures.
Okay. Gina?
Well, I was just particularly intrigued by the one on removing the Henry VIII powers, which I read as basically saying to the blackmailing the Prime Minister, as saying, well, you can't change what we then decide, which I find really odd for somebody who's supposed to be loyal to the party. I mean, I just don't understand that one on the Henry VIII. But it will be interesting on a much wider note on what happens with the bill. We've got the trade bill and the customs union bill, both coming to Parliament. But this whole idea about us being equals, if you have 27 countries on one side and one on the other side, how are we possibly equal? And also, you've got 27 countries who basically have to make sure that the treaties are in place. So if we then are allowed to, if you like, prise open the treaties, such as the Treaty of the Functioning of the EU, it's not just up to them or us. It is actually going to be a huge amount of legal disarray that's created by all of this. And the third thing I'd say is I just find it really interesting, this idea that we're wonderful. I mean, really, the Brexit that the Brexiteers came up with, the deal, was amazing. I mean, it is a fantastic deal if you can get it delivered. But what happens when we leave? Because where are the mechanisms? How do you actually operate? I just want to, on a really practical, everyday basis, this whole idea of ratcheting up a no deal. So from the 30th of March next year, because no deal means no transition, how do we actually work as a country on that day after? If we don't have border controls, we don't have people who can negotiate, because most of them are sitting in the EU, because they haven't had to negotiate. We haven't had to have negotiators for 44 years. But how do we actually then have open skies? How do we deal with Euratom? I mean, how do we actually function the day after? I'm really interested in how we
you're
operate.
Absolutely right. It's an absolutely key question, and quite clearly the government made absolutely clear that this was going to be a complicated negotiation, and there wouldn't be a sort of daily report on what we did today. But there is an interministerial group that meets extremely frequently, sometimes more than once a week, to discuss day one readiness and specifically what happens in the event of no deal. And it goes around department by department. It looks at international agreements. It looks at things like air travel arrangements, customs borders, and so on, as you would expect of any sensible government. So the plans are very advanced, and there will actually, as I mentioned, as part of the Chequers agreement, there will be a stepping up of those no-deal preparations. And in fact, there will be a number of releases of information to different businesses and sectors to advise them on exactly what the government thinks that they should be doing to make sure that they're ready for no deal.
Is it true that we're stockpiling food and medicine?
So what happened? So there was a story about that. So in the winter, the NHS always has a plan to stockpile, if you want to call it that, but they have a plan to make sure that there aren't, regardless of winter and bad weather and so on, that they have a plan. And that plan is in place to deal with bad weather, to deal with any circumstances. So we're not stockpiling medicine, but of course the NHS has a plan, as indeed does the country, for any eventualities, floods, you name it. We have plans in government that deal with particular eventualities.
If I can just...
As I've said.
Dominic Grieve.
I'm glad the government has a plan, but I think we have to be sensible about this. If really, at the end of February, early March, it is clear that there is no deal on anything, there will be a declaration of a state of emergency in this country. Actually, ordinary life will grind to a halt. That is the extent to which our lives are intermeshed with those of our European partners. And that's what will happen.
No.
Andrew, that is what will happen if there is no deal on anything. And so, if I may say, I know that's not what the government wants, and it's not what I want. But I do sit in Parliament, and I listen, not to Jacob, I've not heard him say this, but to my colleague Bill Cash, say that as a result of the referendum, he had abdicated his responsibilities as a member of Parliament to the people. And that in the event of there being no deal in early March or January, his duty was to do absolutely nothing while we skated off the edge of the cliff into this major national crisis. And I have to say, when I heard this, I simply couldn't believe my ears. But that is what the madness that has crept in to some of the discourse in Parliament, because I have to say to Andrew, and I have to say to Jacob, I, as a member of Parliament, will see it as my absolute duty to prevent such an occurrence arising. It's absolutely fundamental. And of course, it's a low risk, because I would rather hope that our EU partners wouldn't wish to see this happen. But it is a risk, and it is there, and we can't ignore it.
Isn't there a huge problem?
Why would you applaud that?
Dominic, your amendments, and sorry, just a moment. I'll come back to you in a second. Dominic, your amendments were designed to put Parliament in the driving seat if a no-deal situation came about. Do you think that that whole process you went through, which a lot of people will look at that and say you came out of it at the end with a statement of the position at the start of the process anyway, do you think that Parliament has ended up empowered after your amendments?
Yes, I do. I mean, bear in mind that ultimately sovereignty does lie with Parliament, and therefore if Parliament wishes to get rid of a government or Parliament wishes to use its standing orders to pass motions to recommend courses of action to government, it can undoubtedly do that. The reason I tabled the amendment, the one which was debated 2-3 weeks ago now, was because I thought it would be helpful to have a structure, because I was concerned that the extent of the emergency that we would face would be so great that it would be useful to have a structure which allowed Parliament to express opinions whilst at the same time not creating a further national crisis of triggering a general election or bringing the government down. And I could see in the back of my mind that that was the risk. That was my motivation in doing it. And also I recognised that the Lord's Amendment, which Lord Hailsham had originally tabled, went, in my view, further than our Constitution allowed. So that was my motivation for it. I didn't get quite what I wanted. I thought I was going to get the formula I wanted. And at the last minute, the Prime Minister backed off, rather to my surprise, having, I thought, pretty much sealed an agreement. But she hadn't sealed it, but we were within a hair's breadth, because it was interference from elsewhere. And as a consequence, I faced a choice, which was either that we had to compromise, and they came up firstly with a formula, which I didn't think was perfect, but in my view will allow Parliament to express opinion, and secondly with a clear recognition of what our constitutional system requires and has. And as it had taken quite a lot to extract that from the government, once I had that, it seemed to me that to try and defeat the government would precipitate an internal crisis within my party where we would stop talking to each other, which I think is not a very good thing, because I think talking to each other is quite important in view of the problems we face. So I took a perfectly clear and conscious decision that I should accept what we had, at the risk of being seen to be the grand old Duke of York, because I thought it was sufficient for my purposes to ensure that Parliament would have the necessary say in those circumstances, and it wasn't my intention to do some symbolic bloody nose to the government, which otherwise I try as far as I can to support.
John Mills, do you think there's any deal that can be agreed by the government that will actually get through Parliament?
I think there's a possibility, although I'm not absolutely certain it would depend entirely on government votes. I think it might be dependent on some Labour votes as well, and that has all sorts of problems of its own. I think there is a possibility that there won't be a deal that Parliament is prepared to accept, in which case we are going to have a different sort of crisis to face up to. But going back to this question about no deal, I don't think any of us want to finish up in a situation where there's no deal, especially at the last minute when the preparations inevitably are going to be incomplete and which is going to produce some difficulties for everybody, which could be quite severe. But I think the problem is, if you go into negotiations never in any circumstances prepared to walk away, however bad the deal you're offered is, you do then give all the negotiating cards to the other side. And going back to what Andrew was saying, you know, if the government is going to hold the position it's got now, which is not one which a lot of people think is terribly satisfactory, but, you know, life being what it is, it's a compromise which we may have to live with. If this gets eroded away by more and more concessions being asked for by the European Union on immigration or goodness knows what else, then I think it just increases the chances that in the end we finish up with a crisis where nothing goes through Parliament at all. And it does seem to me in these circumstances for the government to be prepared to prepare for no deal has to be the right thing to do. Not because that's where the government wants to finish up, but because if it's not prepared to do that, it just hands all the cards to Michel Barnier and we're going to finish up in a very bad place.
This feels like the moment to perhaps have a bit of referendum chat. Can I have a question from Hazel Bentle, please?
Last referendum, the Brexit impact analyses have not been made. Now, I think Andrea Leadsom has said that some 6% of MPs and peers have seen the Brexit impact analyses and none of the public. So I'd just like to say, I think there are an awful lot of people debating, talking and doing all sorts of things to do with politics which actually aren't really looking at the realities of how it'll affect ordinary people. So my question is, if there were to be a second referendum, what should the question be?
Shukra Ramuna, you're part of the People's Vote campaign.
I am proudly part of the People's Vote campaign. Look, ultimately the question would be for Parliament to determine, which is as it should be. The whole reason we started this process was apparently because Parliament needed to take back control. I kind of believed it had control in any event. But my preference would be for us to have the option to either leave with the Prime Minister's deal, whatever that is, or to stay in and reform our country within the European Union. I just want to say a couple of things actually on that, because I deliberately didn't say something earlier, because Jeremy Paxman-like had told us the order in which this debate would happen. But look, a few things about that. I think the first thing is the problem in part with the original proposition was that it was a binary choice. But it reserved to Parliament the form of Brexit. And it's a very good question that Joe asks. Is there any particular form of Brexit that you can reach consensus on in Parliament? I'm not sure there is, frankly. Partly because Brexit in the form that it was promised, you know, your £350 million extra per week for the NHS, all the benefits but out, no big divorce bill was ever mentioned, all of that's turned out to be a bit of a fantasy and undeliverable. I mean, that's the real reason that David Davis and Boris Johnson are throwing their toys out the pram, is because the dream that Boris described was a dream, it was a fantasy, and now we're dealing with reality. We actually, I mean, Andrea, actually all of us were involved in the debate in 2016, and let's be honest about it, all of us were having a hypothetical debate. We were all predicting what would happen if we voted to leave the European Union, but now we've actually got the facts. We know the reality of that, and that's why ultimately I don't think this is something that should, particularly given that people were involved in instigating the process, be reserved to 650 members of Parliament. I think when you're determining something that is going to affect the destiny of our country, 65 million people, you've got to bring them back into that equation. And on this whole, let's go straight to it, thwarting the will of the people argument. You can't thwart the will of the people if they are the ones who determine what we're going to do. It's not like either Jacob or me are sitting in a ballot box saying, you will remain, you will do this, or whatever it is. It's for the people to determine. And I don't have a problem with having different referendums on this issue. Look, we have general elections every 5 years. We don't live in a one-party state. Democracy is not static. It is dynamic. You know, that's the nature of democracy. And here we have got a proposition, when we get this deal, if we get a deal, which people can actually make a decision on. They will know what Brexit looks like. We didn't know what it was going to look like before. We will know what it will look like at the end of this year. And that's why, you know, we should express a view as parliamentarians, of course, but I don't think you can exclude the people, particularly the one group of people who haven't been mentioned at all in this debate in this room so far, are young people They are going to have to live with the consequences of this far longer than anyone else anyone on this stage, frankly, probably anybody in this room, and over 1 million young people who can now vote haven't had any say on this at all.
Gina Miller, what question would you like to see if there was a second referendum? Do you back a second referendum?
I would like, in my view, the people to have their say again, because I think it will be a clean vote, bearing in mind all the things that are now coming up and revelations day after day. So a clean vote on the real options, because we haven't had that so far. So it's not a replay, it's not a second referendum, it's none of those things. This is people looking at what are the realities, what are the choices, and deciding if they want to validate it or not. That's actually, and if Jacob and all the Leavers think that they'll get an even bigger vote, as I'm told, then fine. That's absolutely fine. Because we have Brexit, and then we have the country. Because whatever happens with Brexit, we still have to bring this country together. And you can't have people saying, there was dark money, there was dark forces, therefore I'm not happy with this. You can't have others saying, I was lied to. We really have to find a way of getting past where we are, stop blaming each other, and just have, as I said, a clean vote on the real options, and we move on. And to me, the most democratic thing we can do is say to people, actually, it's all options. I'm not sure how this necessarily would work, but in an ideal world, I would say it's all options. It's Mrs. May's deal, because I think Mrs. May will still be there, and I think it's right that she is still there. The special deal we already have, and we explain to people, because nobody actually explained what it is, all the details of what we have now, and remaining, but it cannot be status quo. We have to accept that there are things wrong in the EU, and we have to accept there are domestic reasons for Brexit as well. So, to my mind, the most ideal thing would be a remain and reform agenda, both EU level and domestic level, the deal we have, and then we move on, whatever that deal is. I'm not sure how you make that happen, and because it has to be granted by Parliament, because it's Parliament that has to decide this. And the only reason I would go along this route, and I reluctantly go along this route for somebody who does believe in parliamentary sovereignty and invested and a lot of time, money, and my safety to ensure that MPs are doing exactly what they're doing now, is the fact that I don't think the arithmetic is there, and there isn't a deal that will keep everyone happy. And that's the only reason I think it's got to go back to the people, plus the fact I think it will bring the country back together. It might be very idealistic, but I think maybe that's the thing that will do it.
Jacob Rees-Mogg, do you think Theresa May will be in power this time next year?
Yes.
And what if she's not? I'm going to throw that question around and ask Chuka Ramuna to you. Let's say, it's a less hypothetical question with Theresa May, isn't it? Let's say she's not there by the end of Brexit.
I don't see any appetite within the Parliamentary Party to remove the Prime Minister. I think people like me...
There has been at least one letter handed in already.
One letter? I mean, they've got another 47 to go. They're
so you
just over 2% of the way there. They're 98%.
You don't believe they have enough numbers to get a vote of no confidence?
I have no idea, but I don't think that there is a vote for that. And Dominic and I are two sides of the same coin in some respects, that we have both opposed and vigorously opposed aspects of government policy in relation to Brexit. But neither of us has made this a personal issue about the Prime Minister. And I think that is a way of keeping some degree of unity within the Conservative Party.
But your parliamentary colleagues do talk about you as a possible Prime Minister. Would you like the chance to run the country?
Very few of them talk about me as a prospective Prime Minister. Look at the laughter in the room. I mean, they'd have hysterics if this were proposed seriously. Mr. Ramuna is going to be leader of the Labour Party long before I'm leader of the Conservative Party. Well, actually, I backed Andrea for the leadership, but...
I'd like to open it up for the floor. Believe it or not, we've actually been going for almost an hour and a half. Wow. So, gentleman in the second row.
No, nobody's told
Don't say.
You know.
Sadly, I'm old enough to have voted in the referendum for joining the European Union. And I remember the disruption that was caused when we went into the European Union. My community were horticulturalists, market gardeners, people with orchards in deepest West Sussex, and within 5 years, most of those businesses have been adversely affected. Market gardens closed, orchards grubbed up. What sectors of business does the panel think would be positively affected and adversely affected by the inevitable disruption that will occur when we leave the European Union?
Andrea, would you like to take that one?
Well, I absolutely love the horticulture sector, and having been in the DEFRA position, Environment Secretary, had the great pleasure of visiting some of the amazing horticultural businesses in West Sussex and all around the country. And certainly, as we've already said, there is a need anyway, in or out of the EU, for much more investment in capital, less investment in just people and more investment in capital. And I do think that in or out of the EU, that particular sector can thrive, and particularly as we come out of the common agricultural policy, because our intention with agriculture is to provide much more support for investment in capital-intensive goods. So things like, for example, robots to pick fruit and that sort of thing, which actually is the way of the future, and much more intensive, focused crop spraying and that sort of thing, which would be both cheaper and much better for the environment. So I actually genuinely think horticulture can do very well under a non-CAP future in the United Kingdom. And then, of course, we are literally, the UK is at the forefront of the next industrial revolution, whether it's artificial intelligence, the development of robotics, life sciences, personalised medicines, all of the advances in technology, where the UK really is at the forefront. We're also the world's leader in offshore wind technology and in other renewable technologies. All of these things, once we're out of the European Union and we are able to export around the world, to trade with the rest of the world, they will all be opportunities for the United Kingdom. It's not just about being in the EU. And what's very clear about leaving the EU is that it's essential that we're able to negotiate free trade deals elsewhere, and that's what we'll be able to do.
I'm afraid on that note, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to have to wrap it up as we're running out of time. We have run out of time. I'd just like to say thank you to all of our panelists, and I'd like to ask that we show the appreciation in the usual way, please. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Andrew. Very much. It was a pleasure. Thanks very much. Cheers. So what did we lose? I don't know, but... it was a loss, was it?